Recently, amateur online trading has blown up over the last 3 or 4 years. It started with Robinhood doing zero trade fees, then the crypto boom, followed by trading due to boredom during quarantine. And don't get me started on Wall Street bets. Basically, lots of amateurs having access to trading who should not have been trading in the first place. This would have obviously led to a lot of inexperience and bad trades, causing losses both big and small. However, despite all the bad trades that occurred during this time, there was actually a specific moment in time that we can pinpoint as literally being the worst trade in history. Not so much in the vein of stock and Wall Street trading, but more akin to 17th century commerce. In my previous video, I talked about how pepper really got the spice race off the ground. And this kind of follows right after that. In this case, it's the late 1500s, about 100 years after Columbus discovered America. European nations had begun international travel in obtaining spices from India, which eventually led to the development of technology to travel to and colonize North America. France claimed a province at Gaspe Peninsula in 1534. Spain claimed much of modern-day Mexico, Florida, and the Caribbean by 1550. Britain claimed parts of the East Coast between 1607 and 1634, and the Dutch settled New Netherland in 1614. Despite North America having literally tons of untapped resources, it did not have the infrastructure to farm and export them. So income generation for most European countries was still focused on the spice trade. Voyages to the east weren't always a piece of cake. Sometimes ships didn't make the voyage to or from. Some were attacked by pirates, sometimes the crew died from disease, and sometimes the ships simply sank. This made funding for voyages very risky. In order to find investors to fund these risky ventures, shares or small percentages of the funding were made available to reduce risk and expense. Less risk meant investors were more inclined to buy in. The Dutch government thought this was a pretty good idea and created the Dutch East India Company in 1602 using the same concept. The Dutch East India Company would turn out to be one of the biggest companies in world history. Adjusted for inflation, it would be larger than Apple, Google, and Facebook combined. In today's money, Dutch East India would be worth $7.9 trillion. This is also probably because it was backed by the Dutch government, which does have its perks. But it was also successful due to a specific market strategy: forcefully take land that produces spices and establish a monopoly. One spice in particular that the Dutch East India wanted to monopolize more than anything else was nutmeg. And it was the obsession with monopolizing nutmeg that would eventually cause the downfall of the massive Dutch East India Company. The first stop to taking over the nutmeg trade was controlling the Spice Islands, a chain of islands in Indonesia that had specific conditions to grow nutmeg. The Molucca Islands would make a great spot for the Dutch had the Portuguese not already been there since 1511. The native Moluccans, however, were not fond of the Portuguese being there as they took the island by conquest. The Dutch, seeing this as an opportunity, made alliances with the Moluccan tribes and expelled the Portuguese by force in 1605. The next operation was south of the Moluccan Islands, the Banda Islands. There was little European presence there, so the Dutch were among the first to trade with the Bandanese, and took advantage by making a contract. The Dutch stated in their contract that the Bandanese people were only allowed to export nutmeg onto Dutch vessels, and if they so much as glanced at a foreign country ship, the Dutch were going to lose their minds. Well, it turns out the idea of exclusivity wasn't understood by the Bandanese people. Exclusive? This is my I don't know face. So they exported nutmeg to other countries' ships. When the Dutch found out, they retaliated by saying they weren't friends with the Bandanese anymore and left them alone forever. The end. No, actually they erected a bunch of forts on the Bandanese Islands, cut down nutmeg trees outside Dutch settlements, and executed Bandanese tribal chiefs. The fate of the Bandanese Islands was firmly in the clutches of the Dutch. Well, all except for two. Bigger please. The islands of Ai and Run. Everything else here the Dutch had. Run and Ai were further away from the cluster of islands, and besides they were already controlled by the British, but knowing the Dutch that wouldn't last very long. In 1615, in an act of surprise, 900 Dutch soldiers stormed the island of Ai, taking it over by force, causing many British to flee to Run. Now, at this point, having control of the majority of the islands in the Banda Sea and Indonesia, and having near dominion over the entire nutmeg trade, would the Dutch really sink their time and resources all for one island? Yes! And the obsession over this little tiny island would be the downfall of the Dutch East India Company as we know it today. For 4 years, from 1616 to 1620, the Dutch conducted a siege against Run, until the British eventually capitulated. Now the nutmeg monopoly was complete, and the Dutch East India Company controlled every bit of nutmeg that was traded. However, the British weren't finished with the Dutch, and they were going to hit them hard later on. A few years after the capture of Run, the Dutch began expanding their territory in North America. They built a small colony in present-day Manhattan Island called New Amsterdam in 1625. It wasn't much, just a small population of 2,000, but it was part of the Dutch Republic. In 1664, the British docked 4 frigates in the New Amsterdam harbor. "Oi, remember us!" The British aimed their cannons at the city and said, "Give us this land or turn your colony into a sandbox." The Dutch immediately surrendered and the British took control of New Amsterdam without a shot, calling it New York in honor of the Duke of York. Shortly afterwards, the British and Dutch went to war with each other in what was known as the Second Anglo-Dutch War. There was also a third, and if 3 wasn't enough, a 4th as well. Yeah, they really hated each other. The war ended in 1667 with the Treaty of Breda. And like all treaties during that time, there was negotiations, redrawing of boundaries, and of course, trading of land. The British had control of the island formerly known as New Amsterdam, but were willing to give it back to the Dutch if they returned the island of Run. After spending 4 years sieging for the island and being clinically obsessed with controlling nutmeg, the Dutch turned down the offer of trading Run for New York. Instead, the Dutch agreed to let the English keep New York and the rest of their North American territory, while they kept Run. After all, in the eyes of the Dutch, North America was a largely undeveloped dirt pile, whereas Run was a valuable spice-producing asset. This, folks, was the worst trade in history. The Dutch could not have picked a more worse time to give up their North American territory. Recall, when Europeans were first colonizing North America in the mid to late 1500s, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure to produce or export goods. Wow, this sucks. It was around the time that the Dutch traded their colonies for Run that European settlements began to grow into commercial hubs that provided the framework to produce and export goods, such as Boston, New Haven, Baltimore, Wilmington, and of course New York City. Little did the British know, they were sitting on a gold mine. North America offered goods that weren't available to Europeans, 3 big ones being tobacco, coffee, and sugar. These exports were immensely popular with the Europeans due to their stimulating properties, and made spices look like dry toast. Great Britain eventually expanded their colonies to Georgia, North, and South Carolina. This allowed them to capitalize on tobacco production in the South and own all the distribution ports the East Coast had to offer, including the cosmopolitan center of the world, New York City. Not to mention, North America also offered other untapped goods, such as lumber, grain, and fish. Britain's wealth exploded and would continue well into the 18th century, as they acquired additional land from France and Spain in 1763. Meanwhile, Dutch wealth and influence began to decline, all for a single spice island. Things were not looking good for the Dutch East India Company either. Turns out, investing all your resources into a single market strategy doesn't end well when that market weakens. Europeans had been obsessed with spices for the last 150 years, and now there was something new that made them feel good, and they wanted more. As demand for prices declined, so did the profits of Dutch East India. To add insult to injury, the well-controlled nutmeg monopoly the Dutch fought so hard to maintain finally fell apart in 1770. A French diplomat smuggled nutmeg seeds from the Molucca Islands and planted them in the French colony of Mauritius and all along the east coast of Africa. After losing insurmountable wealth to the growing British East India Company being mismanaged and falling into debt, the Dutch government revoked the company's charter. After a 198-year run, the company was officially defunct on January 1st, 1800, and that really was the worst trade in history.